Professor Diamond is a Pulitzer-prize-winning author of 6 best-selling books about human societies and evolution. UCLA faculty in 1966 as a professor of geography. He won a MacArthur Fellowship in 1985 and was awarded a National Medal of Science in 1999. I found this interesting. He is known as a polymath, someone with a broad and deep knowledge across many subjects, and which we will hear is his ability to synthesize that information across all those topics. So we're in for an illuminating and thought-provoking presentation which Professor Diamond wants us to know that discomfort may lie ahead. We are warned. There'll be time for questions and answers after his talk, and the staff has microphones to come around to you for that portion. We thank you, Professor Diamond, for bringing this incredibly important and consequential topic to us today.
Can you still hear me? It's a pleasure for me to be with you today. I've had a long and happy history at UCLA. I came to UCLA in 1966 as my first teaching job, and I nominally retired last July. That made me, I think, the longest serving faculty member at UCLA, because I have been teaching here as a result for 58 years, but retirement simply means that I'm not teaching classes and I'm not going to faculty meetings, but I'm still working and doing research. Today, for example, I will send off to my editor a manuscript of my 7th book, and I'm still writing papers. My wife is also on the UCLA faculty and has been teaching for something like 40 years. UCLA has treated me well. Any of you who know academia know that most academics spend much of their time complaining about how badly they are treated by their universities. I do not have such complaints. I've been treated well by UCLA, and so it's a pleasure to be with you. I'll talk about the rise and fall of past civilizations and what we can learn from them as guidance for our future. Is there a single reason? There are plenty of societies that collapsed in the past. The Maya, the Khmer, Easter Island, and so on. Is there a single main reason for their collapse? Well, that's like asking, is there a single main reason for the happiness or failure of marriages? Is there a single main reason why people get divorced? If you meet a young couple who are going to get married and they ask you, please tell me what is the most important lesson for happiness in a marriage, any of you with experience of marriages will know that anyone who asks what is the one most important factor, they are doomed for divorce. The reason being that there are approximately 37, as you know from experience, 37 major factors that are essential for happiness in a marriage. To be happy in a marriage, you have to agree about style of argument, about children, about in-laws, about sex, about money, about religion, about politics, et cetera, et cetera. And if you get 36 of those 37 right and you don't get the 37th right, getting one factor wrong is enough to ruin a marriage. My father had close friends who had a happy marriage except for one thing, dealing with a mother-in-law. And seriously, the one incident with a mother-in-law blew up that happy marriage, and both of them were unhappy apart from each other for the rest of their lives. So there are many factors that are responsible for the success and failure of societies. What are some of the main causes of collapses of past society? What are the things that we have to get right today to avoid collapsing as did some past societies? One set of factors are ecological factors. Societies have undermined themselves by flawed ecological policies that have undermined their resource base, or societies have been undermined by external ecological factors such as climate change. There are many examples, and I think many of them will be familiar to you. Easter Island in the Pacific Ocean, the most remote habited piece of land in the world, famous for the gigantic stone statues. Easter Island was settled by Polynesians around AD 1000, and by the time that Europeans arrived, the inhabitants, the Polynesians, were in the process of pulling down their own statues, and they were involved in a civil war with each other and cannibalism. Why? Because they had chopped down all the trees on their island, and those trees included the world's largest palm trees that were their source of liquid and building materials. So Easter Island society collapsed in an episode of self-inflicted ecological damage. Other societies that destroyed themselves, you may not realize that 700 years ago, the largest city in the world was not London and it was not Tokyo. The largest city in the world was a Native American society that we now call Cahokia, at the confluence of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers in St. Louis. Cahokia then had a population perhaps 40,000, but Cahokia collapsed in the 1300s, apparently due to a combination of floods and drought and cold weather. The Anasazi in the US Southwest collapsed as a result of a rather sudden drought. Any of you who've been to Angkor in Cambodia, the center of the Khmer Empire, the Khmer Empire collapsed in the 1400s due to a combination of deforestation and flooding made possible by deforestation on the hillsides. The world was led, the origins of civilization were in the so-called Fertile Crescent of the Mideast. That's where the first agriculture, the most productive agriculture began. That's where writing, that's where metal tools, that's where empires began. But today, the Fertile Crescent, Iraq and Iran are not the world leaders as they were for thousands of years. Why? A combination of drought and self-inflicted damage, irrigation agriculture that pull salt up, salinize the fields. So Iraq and Iran no longer lead the world in civilization or in agriculture. Ecological factors then are have been one reason for collapses. Another set of reason for collapses has been poor choices made by the entire society, not poor choices made by a single leader, but poor choices where the whole society has responsibility. An example are the Vikings, the Norse, who settled Greenland from Norway. Vikings settled Greenland around AD 1000, and they thrived in Greenland for several centuries, but sometime in the 1400s, they all died out. And when Europeans came back to Greenland a couple hundred years later, there were no Vikings left alive in Greenland. Why? The Vikings attempted to transplant to Greenland a Norwegian society based on farm animals, cattle, sheep, and goats. And yes, they managed to make a living with cattle, sheep, and goats in Greenland for a couple of centuries, but as the climate got colder, that no longer worked, and they made a couple of other big mistakes. Greenland today, its economy depends especially on fishing. Greenland has valuable fisheries offshore. The Norse Vikings in Greenland had a taboo on eating fish. Incredibly, they did not eat fish. And as a result, they ran into trouble with getting enough food when it got cold and they were no longer able to grow enough sheep, cattle, and goats. And then another fatal mistake that they made was that when the Norse settled Greenland, there were no other people there. The Inuit, the so-called Eskimos, had not yet arrived. And when the Inuit did arrive, we have a Norse account of their first meeting with the Inuit. Remember that the Inuit were and are masters of Arctic living, who developed so many wonderful strategies, hunting, sleds, dogs, etc., for making a good living in the Arctic. It behooved the Norse to develop good relations with the Inuit. The first meeting of Norse with Inuit was in the 1300s, and we've got an account of the Norse meeting. The Norse said, we met these small people up north, first time we've seen people there, and these people are very interesting. We discovered that if you stab them repeatedly, at first they don't bleed, but then if you stab them hard into the belly, they bleed profusely with lots of blood. Well, that's not a good way to establish a friendly trading relationship with the Inuit, who economically were far superior and militarily were superior to the Norse because the Norse no longer had steel tools, and there were lots more Inuit than there were Norse. Today, an example of a whole society making a poor choice, Britain. So Britain voted some years ago for Brexit by a margin of, I think, 62%, and the British have been realizing realizing today that Brexit was a big mistake. Britain is no longer master of the world as it used to be, able to be self-supporting without worrying about Europe. Britain now is part of Europe, and the British today are, some British are seeing what they can do to restore their relations with Europe. So Brexit is an example of a mistake made by an entire society. But there are also mistakes made not by the entire society, but by individual leaders. Think of various leaders in the past and in recent times who've ruined their society. Any of you who've read the great Greek historian Thucydides, the founder of history, Thucydides describes, among other things, the Athenian politician Alcibiades, charismatic, but heavily damaged Athens by convincing the Athenians to launch an expedition against Syracuse to try to capture Syracuse. The Athenians were defeated on land. Their fleet was sunk in Syracuse harbor. Alcibiades was disastrous for the Athenians. In recent times, any of you familiar with World War I, you remember that the emperor of Germany during World War I was a Kaiser Wilhelm I. He was a messed up person. He had a difficult birth. He was damaged at birth. He was unsure of himself. He had virtually semi-dictatorial power in Germany, and he made many disastrous decisions. One of his disastrous decisions was that fundamental to Germany's military security then and in the Second World War was that Germany faces problems on two fronts, on the Western front against France and on the Eastern front against Russia. And Germany was ruined both in World War I and World War II by ending up fighting on both fronts, not developing allies on one front. Well, the German Chancellor Bismarck had a foreign policy of forming an alliance with Russia so that Germany faced problems just on one front. But Kaiser Wilhelm I ended the alliance with Russia, which was disastrous because it meant that in World War I, Germany was fighting both against Russia and against France, and Germany lost World War I with a terrible death toll. In more recent times, the South American country of of Chile. How many of you have ever been to Chile? Okay. Have ever been? Okay. Fair number of you have been to Chile. I spent a visit to Chile as part of the California-Chile problem when it existed. This was before bad things happened in Chile. When I visited Chile, it was a model of democracy, the richest country in South America. In 1973, Chile suffered a military dictatorship that smashed world records for sadistic tortures, far worse tortures than anything that the Nazis did. And that resulted from blunders by a well-meaning Chilean president, Salvador Allende, admirable person in many ways, with a background in public health, well-intentioned, but he made disastrous mistakes that included bringing Fidel Castro and 100 Cubans to Chile. That did not sit well with many Chileans and with the Chilean army. And bringing extreme leftists into his government, again, that did not sit well with the majority of Chilean people or the Chilean army. And that resulted then in a 1973 coup d'etat in which Allende committed suicide. Another example, Japan in the 1930s. The Japanese military leaders in the 1930s got their overseas training with Nazi Germany, not with the United States. And so Japan's military leaders in the 1930s were not familiar with the United States, thought of the United States as a nation of shopkeepers that was not militarily prepared. And yet the Japanese naval attaché in Washington, Admiral Yamamoto, who later became the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, Yamamoto got to know the United States well when he was here and warned the Japanese military government, for God's sakes, don't make war against the United States, because their population, not only is the population of the US triple that of Japan, but the steel output of the United States is 50 times that of Japan. On my first visit to Japan, I met one of the leaders of the Japanese steel industry who had been in the United States in the 1930s. And he said he was stunned in the US to see the enormous output of high quality steel, enormous compared to that in Japan. And so when he came back to Japan, he said, for God's sakes, don't make war against the US. But the Japanese military leaders, unfamiliar with the US, did make war against the US, and the result was predictable, although it was horribly bloody on both sides. Those then are examples of leaders who provoke disaster for their countries. In the United States today, there are various policies going on that don't promise well for the United States. Policies of the current government as regards medicine. For example, today I read that COVID shots are no longer recommended for young people. The number of Americans who died of COVID, several 100,000, not a good idea. The general dismantling of our medical system at the National Institutes of Health. Economic policies, both as regards budget deficit and tariff policies. The dismantling of our educational system. Imagine the government attacking major universities, government attacking Harvard, Penn, Columbia, and there's a list of other universities that the government is planning to attack, and they include UCLA and UC Berkeley. Not good for American education. I believe that the education department itself of the United States is slated for being abolished. And foreign policy. So these are examples of issues, leadership decisions in the United States comparable to the leadership decisions by Allende and by Kaiser Wilhelm that proved disastrous. Those then are examples of fatal mistakes made by past societies that led to collapses of many past societies. What's different today? What are the biggest dangers that we face today? What's different about risk of collapse today compared to risk of collapse in the past. A major difference, perhaps the biggest single difference, is globalization. In the past, before jet plane travel and before steamship travel, societies were isolated from each other. When the Anasazi disappeared in the US Southwest, nobody knew about it in Britain. When the Maya disappeared in the Yucatan, nobody knew about it in North America. But with globalization, everybody everywhere in the world knows about what's happening everywhere else in the world. Societies are connected to each other by trade and by email and cell phones. The result is that any country in the world can and does have an effect on any other country. Any country, no matter how poor, affects any other country, no matter how distant and no matter how rich. About 50 years ago, before globalization set in, American secretaries of state and their staff used to play a mental game with each other. They would ask, what countries in the world are so poor and so remote that they are irrelevant to American interests, and there's no way that the United States is ever going to have to send troops into those countries and we don't have to be concerned about them in our foreign policy because they are just so poor and so remote. And there was general agreement among secretaries of state then that the three most irrelevant countries to American interests then were Somalia, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Those are three countries into all of which the United States subsequently found it necessary to, or chose to send troops under unhappy circumstances. Why? Because even though Somalia is desperately poor and Afghanistan desperately poor and Iraq, apart from oil, also poor, in our globalized world, things that go on in Somalia, Iraq, and Afghanistan pose trouble for the United States and other countries. For example, Somalia is on the east coast of East Africa, and so small motorized vessels of pirates on the coast of East Africa go out from Somalia and have wreaked havoc among ships in the Indian Ocean. This illustrates then that in our modern globalized world, anybody, any country, anywhere has effects on any country around the world. An example going on within the past year, Yemen. Yemen is one of the poorest countries in the world. Who cares about Yemen? Well, the United States and other people now care about Yemen. Why? Because Yemen is located on the narrow straits of the Red Sea, so that if you want to go in and out of the Suez Canal, which is the fastest, cheapest way to get from Europe to the Near East, you would like to go through the Suez Canal, through the Red Sea, past Yemen. But these very poor people in Yemen have acquired rockets, and they do things with their rockets that have made it inadvisable for ships now to go through the Suez Canal. Globalization then means that any country in the world, no matter how poor and no matter how remote, has consequences for other countries. Another major factor that's new today is climate change caused by people. There has been climate change in the past, the climate change that did in the Anasazi, but climate change was not caused by people because there weren't enough people and we were not burning fossil fuels. The main cause of climate change today is the burning of fossil fuels, which have resulted in a heating of the atmosphere, but that's the heating of the whole atmosphere. It's not the case that if the United States stopped burning fossil fuels, that the atmosphere over the US would cool down and poor Canada and Mexico with their fossil fuels would still heat up. No, the atmosphere is mixed. And so the consumption of fossil fuels by any country in the world affects the whole world. And therefore the risk that we face due to climate change is a risk of a global collapse, not a risk of an individual, of a collapse in single countries. There's a substantial risk that if we carry on as we are doing now, the whole world might become uninhabitable. it does require a global effort to solve the problem of climate change. Climate change is a threat to, certainly it's a threat to our children and grandchildren. It's a threat to some of us. People talk about what the temperature in the world will be like in the year 2050, and the predictions are that as we're going there, at the rate we're going now, the temperature in 2050 will be 2 degrees centigrade warmer than it is now. Well, it's already uncomfortably warm in Los Angeles, and you know what it's like in Phoenix. So if it's 2 degrees warmer in 2050, that will be really bad news. I was born in 1937. I don't expect to be around at the age of 113 in the year 2050. But my kids who were born in 1987, they will be 63 in the year 2050. And many of you have children, and I'm sure that many of you have grandchildren whom you have to expect are going to be around in 2050. In fact, many of you have children and grandchildren who are going to be around in the year 2100, and God knows what world temperature is going to be like in the year 2100. So all of you have a personal investment through your children and grandchildren in the state of the world in the year 2050, whether or not you yourselves would be around then. A third new danger added to the ones that have threatened societies in the past is the danger of nuclear war. Those of you who have reached my advanced age may remember I remember the atomic bombs. And after the atomic bombs, there was concern about the risk of a nuclear war. I remember the 40s, 50s, 60s, fear of nuclear war, and in 1962, we now know the closest we've ever been to an actual nuclear war between the United States. It came very close. There was a Russian submarine whose commander was prepared to shoot nuclear weapons, and that commander was wrestled down by sailors on the boat. But if it had not been for that, if that commander had used nuclear weapons, the United States would have used nuclear weapons. Fortunately, there have since 1945, nuclear weapons have not been used. Probably the reason undoubtedly is that the countries that have nuclear weapons know that other countries have nuclear weapons, and they know every country with nuclear weapons, Russia, China, the United States, Britain, France, etc., knows that if they use, India, Pakistan, knows that if they use their nuclear weapons against some other country with nuclear weapons, even if they wiped out the cities of that other country, there are nuclear weapons scattered all over the landscape. And any country with nuclear weapons that makes a war with another country with nuclear weapons can be certain that there is going to be a devastating attack, even if they succeed in wiping out all of the cities of the other country. So recently, in the last couple of weeks, there's been an armed confrontation between India and Pakistan. Both India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons. And yes, they fought and they sent airplanes and missiles, but neither of them used their nuclear weapons. Why not? Because they knew perfectly well that if India uses its nuclear weapons, they cannot knock out the Pakistan sites and vice versa. So it would be irrational now to use nuclear weapons, and that's undoubtedly why there has not been another further use of nuclear weapons since 1945. Rational leaders would not use nuclear weapons. But as you undoubtedly know by reading the newspaper and perhaps other experiences, there are irrational leaders. The leader of North Korea today cannot be considered rational. And Putin cannot be considered rational. There are other leaders that some of you can think of that you would not consider rational. So the risk is that irrational leaders might plunge us into a nuclear war. I've given you many reasons to be concerned and pessimistic. What are the reasons to be hopeful? There are major reasons to be hopeful. One reason to be hopeful is to recognize that the world will be a globalized world will be unstable as long as there are poor countries and rich countries. In in the past, 50 years ago, there could be poor countries out there and they had no effect on rich countries. But today, poor countries affect rich countries. So our world is going to be unstable as long as there are big differences in wealth around the world as there are today. But there is now foreign aid. There is not nearly enough foreign aid, but there is some foreign aid, which is and foreign aid should not be thought of as charity. Foreign aid is selfish policy on the part of rich countries, aiming to protect themselves and to protect the whole world by improving living conditions in poor countries that otherwise could make trouble for them. Foreign aid takes many forms. It takes the form of medical assistance funded by wealthy countries, has eliminated smallpox, the worst disease of recent human history. I have a smallpox vaccination. Nowadays, we don't get vaccinated, get smallpox. Why? Because lots of money was spent by rich countries to eliminate smallpox. Rich countries spent money to eliminate rinderpest in East Africa and Eurasia, the most severe disease of farm animals. Polio, there's been a program to eliminate polio. So far, it hasn't eliminated the last of polio. There's still polio in a couple of places, but polio has been eliminated in much of the world, although with modern policies in the United States, it's coming back in the United States. A major effort has gone into eliminating malaria, the most serious disease for most of the world, though not of the United States. So foreign aid takes the form of medical aid. It also takes the form of economic assistance. There are development organizations that have asked themselves, what's the most effective, given that we got a finite amount of money, what's the most effective way with small amounts of money that we can help poor countries? And an experiment carried out in Kenya, in a couple of villages in Kenya, where there was enough money to provide, I think the equivalent of $30 a year for each inhabitant in the village. What's the best way to spend $30 per inhabitant for a year? Turns out that the two most useful ways were to provide bed nets under which you can sleep at night to keep out the mosquitoes that carry malaria. Bed nets are cheap and they last for half a year. So you can buy a modest amount of money. You put everybody in the village under bed nets and end malaria. And the other cheap way was to provide high quality corn seed that's more fertile and more productive than the seed that Kenyans had. To provide everybody in the village with high quality corn seed was relatively inexpensive. And so for a modest amount of money, a few $1,000s for a village, turned out to be possible to improve the standard of living of the whole village. The climate problem, what's the reason for hope with the climate problem? The climate problem is not advancing glaciers due to the ice ages. The climate problem is caused by us and only by us, by burning fossil fuels. All that we have to do is to reduce our consumption of fossil fuels and increase our use of renewable energy resources such as wind, solar, tidal, hydroelectric, and renewable energy sources are now competitive economically with fossil fuels. Young people are taking these matters seriously. Older people know, but young people expect to be around 30 or 40 years from now. And they have an investment in the state of the world of the year 2050, whereas I, at age 88 and 87, my contemporaries, don't have a personal investment because we won't be there then. And then finally, a reason for hope is public protests. In my lifetime, and I'm sure many of you have seen that, there have been public protests by unarmed people against well-armed, determined governments that were carrying out policies that large numbers of unarmed people disagreed with. And you've all lived through public protests in which protesters got killed, but the result was change in government policy. The development of the civil rights movement in the United States took a long time in the 50s and 60s. There's much still to be done. and it took a long time, and people got killed, people volunteered, and some of them got killed. But the result was a change in civil rights policy in the face of a government, the majority of whose officials were determined to maintain discriminatory civil rights policies. Kent State, any of you who remember the Vietnam War will remember the killings at Kent State. There were student protests, and 4 students got killed at Kent State. It electrified the country. After the killings at Kent State, 4 million students came out and protested, and the US government, although Nixon and the military were prepared to kill more students, 4 million students taken to the streets, that was more. The government was not willing to kill 4 million students. Indonesia had a military dictatorship. It was overthrown in 1990. Why? Because 100,000 people came protesting onto the streets of Jakarta, and the Indonesian army was willing to kill plenty of Indonesians, but was not willing to kill 100,000 Indonesians. Nevertheless, that doesn't mean that protests are always going to succeed. There are governments that are willing to kill large numbers of people. The protests in China in Tiananmen Square did not succeed. Protests in Russia don't succeed. Protests in fascist Italy and fascist Germany in the 1930s didn't succeed. And so we don't know what's going to happen in the United States. Why aren't there protests in the United States, widespread protests now against government policies, when there are government policies that are affecting and harming large numbers of people? Question of speculation. Is it that potential protesters in the United States, the students who would be protesting and are protesting, they're focused on Palestine and Israel rather than focused yet on things that affect them personally? Is that why we're not seeing protests against government policies? Is it because of fear of retaliation? Protesters now don't simply get killed. They might get sent, they are getting sent to Sudan and to prisons in El Salvador. And you might well prefer to be killed than get sent to Sudan or prisons in El Salvador. But protesters in the past in the United States were willing to risk death. And if they're willing to risk death, one wonders why they're not out on the streets willing to risk being sent to Sudan and El Salvador. Maybe it's just too early. Maybe the government policies against which students would protest have been going on for just a couple of months, and it's not enough time. So in short, that then concludes what I wanted to talk about. There are, in the past, governments have undermined themselves, people have undermined themselves, leaders have undermined themselves, societies have collapsed as a result. Societies have also collapsed because of exogenous things such as climate change. All of those things are still going on today. They're going on in a different world, a globalized world, where you can't have Easter Island collapsing and nobody else knows about it. The risk that we face now is the risk of global collapse. Are there reasons for hope? Yes, there are reasons for hope. There is now worldwide foreign aid, not enough, but some of it. And there is concern about climate change, and there have been protests that have succeeded in the United States. So I hope that there will be a happy landing. We shall see. Thank you.
If anyone has any questions, we have microphones.
Hi, my question is this. I understand what you just said about the fear of retaliation for protests and so forth. What we need is a person like Martin Luther King or Malcolm X or Eugene McCarthy against the Vietnam War. Someone powerful who represents a good movement and who can articulate what we need to do. Is there anyone in your mind that we have like that, that we can hope will get out there and we can encourage them to do so.
Good point. Think of the protests that have succeeded. They've succeeded with people like Mario Savio at Berkeley and Martin Luther King and Cesar Chavez. Is there such a person? Such a person in the United States now has not yet revealed herself or himself, but there are 330 million Americans, and there are millions of potential Mario Savios out there. They just have not spoken up yet.
Will they be revealed?
I was teaching science and religion with the Yankee fan Carol Bacos.
Carol Bacos, the beloved Carol Bacos, head of our Center for the Study of Religion, and would-be founder of a department of religion, which I believe UCLA in its wisdom has not yet seen fit to embrace. Carol and I have been teaching, although I'm, quotes, retired, Carol and I have been teaching this past semester a Fiat Lux course, which had its last meeting yesterday. And it was an interesting meeting. We have had 16 highly motivated students, all of whom gave their individual presentations. I was struck by a couple of things. One, that all the students gave their presentations with a computer in front of them, and they were all reading their presentations. There was nobody who spoke spontaneously. The younger generation nowadays does not learn how to speak spontaneously. And it appeared that all of the students in the course came from a background, while they knew something about science, their background nevertheless was background in religion rather than in science.
Thank you. I'm concerned about the selfishness of individuals and of countries to work together to address some of the serious issues we've got. Countries are in it for themselves, at least that's how they act. And that's the basis of my concern, as well as individuals.
That is a good reason to be concerned. Selfish countries and selfish individuals. There are 216 countries in the world, and that means that there are 216 selfish countries, and there are 9.2 billion people in the world, and that means that there are 9.1 billion selfish individuals out there in the world. But that's the bad news. The good news is that these 216 selfish countries, many of them sometimes do unselfish things, and some individuals in them do unselfish things. For example, this week Bill Gates announced that he's going to give away his $40 billion, not over the course of the next century, but over the course of the next few decades. And $40 billion, it's not the budget of the US government, but there's a lot that you can do with $40 billion, a lot more than you can do with $3,000 in each Kenyan village. So yes, there are selfish countries, all of them, and there are selfish individuals, almost all of them, but sometimes those selfish countries and those selfish individuals do good things.
Okay. Thank you for being here today. My husband and I have had the pleasure of seeing Edward Cheraminsky, the dean of Berkeley's Law School, several times, lecturing down here last year or so. And he talked about how structurally the United States is changing, particularly with a very conservative Supreme Court. And he said in his last speech, if you're conservative, you're doing hamstrings right now. But if you're a liberal, you said you're in for a long, dark period. I was 18 in 1973 when Roe v. Wade was put in law. It was astonishing to me when it was overturned. Do you kind of see the same dark period ahead for us? And he said, we're going to have this dark period for 30 years. As if there's one thing that makes you live a long life, it's being put on the Supreme Court.
Naturally, I'm upset about the Supreme Court and about various other judges. what's going to happen? I don't know. I remember attending, I was at a meeting a couple of years ago where most of the people at the meeting were liberally minded politically. And there was a middle of the road journalist speaker who was talking about how upset most of us liberals at the meeting were about various policies. And he said, but now that Obama is in, conservatives now are as upset under Obama as all of you liberals were under the Bushes. So yes, I'm upset. What's going to happen with the Supreme Court? I don't know. Is there going to be another chance? Is there going to be a Democratic election in the year 2028? I don't know. Things can happen. I'm sure that you have fantasies before you go off to sleep at night about what you would do if you had considerable power, and there are anyways. So what's going to happen? I don't know.
I will say there was one bright note that you said. You told all the audience, please get out and vote in the local elections. Because state governments matter, local governments matter. Who you elect as your governors and congressmen. So you said, please do that.
In Italy and in Indonesia, the turnout of Indonesians with not much experience of democracy and of Italians in national elections is never below 80%, and it's up to 93%. In the United States, the highest turnout for any presidential election was 60%, and the turnout for mayor of Los Angeles, one of the big cities in the United States, the turnout is 20%. If you don't like the government of Los Angeles, you, meaning citizens of Los Angeles, it is your fault.
You mentioned Mario Savio as being a leader at Cal. I was a student at Cal at the time, and I don't really think he was a leader. I think the press attached that title and that role to him. And that's how the leaders can often be determined. They take somebody who happens to be speaking in that moment. But my real question is, what is it that you should hold? You said at 3 and you send that quote. And as somebody who protested in the 60s, I felt like we were pretty successful. The war ended, the civil rights legislation was introduced and passed. And I don't see how it's going to be successful without that. Just millions of people just protesting.
Yes, in my lifetime and in your lifetime, protests in the United States have been remarkably successful when you consider the resistance that they faced, the resistance that the civil rights movement faced in large areas of our country, the resistance that the Vietnam protesters faced in the US government. And it took decades in the case of the civil rights movement, took years in the case of the Vietnam War, but much progress. When my first class at UCLA that I taught in 1966, there were 62 medical students, and those 62 medical students consisted of 60 white men, 1 white woman, and 1 Chinese woman. UCLA Medical School, 7 years before I arrived, had admitted its first African American, and then decided that it was not going to repeat that mistake, and so it did not admit another African American until years later. Things have changed. In my classes at UCLA for the last couple of decades, so-called white students have been in a minority. Women in my classes have been in a majority in every one of my classes for the last couple of decades. like 65%. Why? Um, students in my class apply, and I and my TAs select the students. The last names, many of them are from foreign, so we don't know what the genders are. And when the students turn up that we've selected on the basis of their application, lo and behold, it turns out that 65% of them are women. Why? Because a majority of UCLA students are now women, and because women are more motivated and they are less distracted by various things that they should not be distracted by, as are men. All of which is a long-winded way of saying there have been changes at UCLA and changes in the United States in my lifetime. Have the changes been enough? No.
By the way, I just wanted to add one more thing. You talked about people being killed in protests. I don't believe anybody was killed until Tennessee.
I'm sorry?
I said, I don't think there were any murders or killings.
There were 4 people.
Until Kent State.
At Kent State, there were 4 people killed. I was reading it this morning. 4 people killed and 9 people wounded and sent to the hospital.
So I'm curious about
Yeah.
I have a question. I'm worried about all the things everyone's worried about, of course, but my recent concern is the US economy seems to be taking a dive. Moody's is the last of the agencies that have degraded it. Our bonds are not as they have been forever. And the country seems to be sliding into an economic debacle. And I hope I'm not reading alarmist things, but some people are wondering if it will ever be able to recover. And I'm not sure.
That is a matter among the problems of the United States now are the problems of the economy. I have to tell you that when I see bad signs for you, when I see declines of the stock market, and when I see threats to bonds, my reaction is great, because it's going to take that for people invested in the current situation to change their policies. If people change the deterioration of the economy will motivate people who otherwise will not be motivated in the United States, and maybe will motivate them enough to reverse direction, not just in the economy, but in other things that I care about.
Okay, I just have 2 questions. Well, the first one is a comment really, because I was at the march last month at Wilshire and Veteran, right outside of UCLA. And we had about 2,000 people there, and there was no coverage in the news at all, so no one even knew what happened until many days later I read a little bit about it. But that's, my main question is for you. What is your 7th book?
What is?
You said you were about to publish your 7th
Oh.
book, and I'm curious to know
Yes, the
what
book.
the topic is.
The book that I'm sending off to my editor today is about the question of leadership. And in particular, it's not about how to be an effective leader. It's not what they teach you in business school, which is all wrong anyway. It's instead about the circumstances under which a leader can make a difference. There are circumstances under which a leader can't have an effect. If you are the CEO of a public utility company, you are so regulated that you can't have a big effect. If you are the CEO of a computer company or a perfume company or a t-shirt company, you can have an effect. And so the book that I'm sending off today is about the conditions under which leaders can have an effect. And I hope that it will be out in the fall of next year. We shall see.
I have one question. This is women in philanthropy. We did bring up the subject of women. What do you think the effect will be when there are more and more women in leadership positions? It has to happen eventually. I know there's still a good solid glass ceiling. But what do you see as the changes that might occur?
change in leadership position with respect to gender, I think. Yeah. The changes in my lifetime. I mentioned what I saw at UCLA in 1966. In my department, when I joined my UCLA physiology department, then there were 20 men and 2 women. In my geography department now, the men are still in a majority, but the women are maybe 40%. And the recent hires have mainly been of women. Is this enough? Of course it's not enough. What about the glass ceiling? Yes, it's encouraging at lower levels. It's not encouraging enough at higher levels. The United States has not yet had a woman president, whereas Britain has had women prime ministers, including some extremely effective ones. Iceland has had no man prime minister for a decade or two. So the trend is in the right direction, including in the United States, but it's not enough. But the story of the world, the story of our lives, everything is not enough.
We can't thank